Johnny Carson, Ed Ames, and the night television learned to wait. 3 hours before air, Johnny Carson sat alone in his dressing room at NBC Studio 6B, reviewing the night's rundown. December 1965. The holiday season pressed against Rockefeller Center's windows. Cold, insistent, commercial. On paper, the evening looked standard. Musical guest, comedy bit, interviews. Ed Ames, the actor from Daniel Boone, would demonstrate Tomahawk throwing, a promotional segment. Nothing more. Carson had done thousands of these. The format was muscle memory by now. Intro, banter, demonstration, applause, commercial break. He knew how to pace energy, when to interrupt, when to let a guest shine. Control was everything in live television. You built the rhythm, maintained it, never let silence linger too long. Dead air was failure. Laughter was currency, but only if you could bank it quickly and move forward. He glanced at his notes. Ed Ames, singer, actor, Native American character on television. The Tomahawk bit would eat maybe 4 minutes. Safe, visual, the kind of segment that filled time without demanding much from anyone. What Carson didn't know, what nobody in that building could know, was that in approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, he would experience the longest sustained laugh of his career. And in that laughter, in those impossible minutes when nothing he did could stop the audience's reaction, he would learn something about control he had spent a decade trying to master. That sometimes, surrendering it was the only honest choice left. The studio audience filed in at 6:30, excited and cold from the December streets. Studio 6B held about 400 people, packed close, the heat of bodies and anticipation already building before the cameras went live. These weren't tourists. Tonight Show audiences in 1965 were savvy, television literate, expecting something. They understood timing, respected the format, knew when to laugh and when to hold back. Johnny Carson, 39 years old, had been hosting The Tonight Show for 3 years. The show was his now, his rhythm, his territory, his rules. He'd inherited it from Jack Paar, whose emotional intensity had made the program unpredictable, sometimes uncomfortably personal. Carson brought something different. Distance, control, a performer's polish that never quite cracked. He was funny, but not desperate. Charming, but never vulnerable. The audience loved him for what he didn't show as much as what he did. Backstage, Ed Ames prepared for his segment. He was 40 years old, established. His television show Daniel Boone had made him recognizable, though he was primarily known as a singer, one of the Ames brothers, a vocal group that had achieved success in the previous decade. Tonight he would talk about the show, maybe sing if time permitted, and demonstrate a skill he'd learned for his role as Mingo, Daniel Boone's companion, throwing a tomahawk. The prop department had provided a standard wooden tomahawk and a plywood board shaped like a human figure, roughly 6 feet tall, outlined in white against the wood. It stood backstage, waiting. Nobody had tested the throw. Nobody thought to. It was filler. Television ate moments like this a dozen times a night, every night, across every channel. Nothing stuck. Everything moved. The show began at 11:30, as it always did. Carson's monologue landed well. Jokes about holiday shopping, political jabs that were sharp but not angry, the kind of comedy that confirmed the audience's intelligence without challenging their comfort. Applause, laughter, the familiar rhythm establishing itself. First guest, second guest. The hour moved forward with the precision Carson demanded of himself and everyone around him. Ed Ames came out near the end of the show, perhaps 40 minutes before sign-off. He moved easily, comfortable in the space. Carson greeted him warmly, genuinely. There was no edge between them, no competition. Ames talked about Daniel Boone, the challenges of playing a Cherokee character as a white actor, a conversation that would register differently in later decades, but in 1965 passed as standard promotional chat. Then Carson shifted. Now, I understand you've learned to throw a tomahawk for the show. That's right, Ames said. It's something Mingo would need to know. And you actually practice this? Quite a bit. It's harder than it looks. The crew brought out the plywood target, the human-shaped board, white outline stark against the wood. They placed it stage left, visible to the audience, the cameras, Carson at his desk. The tomahawk appeared, simple and wooden, a prop that looked authentic enough for television. Carson stood, walked toward the target with Ames. This was the format. Host participates, makes himself the amateur, lets the guest be the expert. It was generous performance, the kind of thing Carson did naturally, stepping back, creating space for others to succeed. "So how do you do this?" Carson asked. Ames explained the grip, the wrist motion, the distance required. Carson made a few jokes about frontier life, about his own lack of coordination. The audience laughed, but gently. They were waiting for something, though they didn't know what. Television had taught them that demonstrations often went wrong in entertaining ways. The cake that collapses, the animal that refuses to perform. Failure was funny. Success was polite applause, and then the commercial break. "Would you like to try first?" Ames asked Carson. No, Carson said quickly. "I want to see how it's supposed to look. Then I'll embarrass myself." The audience chuckled. Carson returned to his position near the desk, giving Ames room, giving the cameras a clear frame. Doc Severinsen and the band waited, silent. The studio settled into that particular attention that precedes something physical, something potentially dangerous, even if only slightly. Ed Ames stepped back, measuring the distance. About 12 feet, maybe 15. Close enough to be accurate, far enough to require genuine skill. He held the tomahawk properly, the way he'd been taught by the show's technical advisors, the way he'd practiced dozens of times off camera. He raised his arm. The studio was completely quiet now, the kind of silence that felt like breath being held. And then he threw. The tomahawk flew straight and true. It rotated once, twice, the kind of clean throw that comes from muscle memory and repetition. It struck the plywood target with a solid thunk that carried across the studio. Stuck firm. Dead center. But not dead center of the board. Dead center of the crotch. The blade had embedded itself precisely between the outlined figure's legs, at groin level, unmistakable in its placement and implication. For one beat, nobody reacted. Comprehension took a moment. The visual information had to travel from the target to the audience's eyes through their recognition of what they were seeing into the understanding of what it meant and why it was funny. Television didn't usually allow this kind of accident. Television was controlled, edited, safe. Then someone laughed. A single audience member, involuntary, sharp, and that laugh ignited something. The audience erupted. Not polite laughter, not even strong laughter. Something beyond that, a wave of reaction so immediate and total that it seemed to have physical presence in the studio. 400 people laughing at once, fully, without reservation or self-consciousness. Carson froze. His face registered shock, delight, disbelief. He looked at the target, at Ames, at the audience, then back at the target. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The laugh was too big. It filled every available space, left no room for words. Ed Ames stood still, tomahawkless, his expression caught between pride at the accuracy of his throw and mortification at where it had landed. He raised his hands slightly, a small, helpless gesture. His face, usually composed, performer smooth, showed genuine surprise, and the audience kept laughing. Carson tried to speak. "I didn't know." The laugh swallowed his words. He stopped, waited, tried again. "Ed, nothing." The sound was too large. This was not how television worked. Television was paced, controlled, built on timing that the host dictated. Carson was famous for his ability to ride a laugh, to extend it with a look or a gesture, and then cut it off with the next joke, the next line, maintaining control of the room's energy. But this laugh had its own momentum, its own life. It wasn't following Carson's lead. It was simply happening, and he was inside it. He walked toward the target, slowly. The movement gave the audience something new to focus on, a visual shift that might have redirected attention. Instead, it made them laugh harder. The closer Carson got to the target, the clearer the placement became, the more absurd the accident seemed. Carson stood next to the board, looking at it. The tomahawk jutted from the crotch of the outlined figure, perfectly centered, impossibly precise. He turned to Ames with an expression of mock amazement. "I didn't even know you were Jewish," he said. The audience screamed. The laugh somehow found another level, deeper and more helpless. People were gasping now, some doubled over, others wiping tears. The studio's acoustics amplified everything, the sound bouncing off walls and ceiling, feeding back into itself. Carson tried to continue. "That's the first time." The laugh crushed the sentence. He stopped, smiled, shook his head. Tried again. "I don't think I've ever..." Gone. What happened next was something Carson rarely allowed himself. He surrendered. He stopped trying to speak, stopped trying to control the timing. Instead, he simply stood there, next to the target, looking at it, then at Ames, then at the audience, letting the laugh exist without fighting it or shaping it. His face showed something unexpected for Carson, genuine helplessness. Not performed, not a bit. Real inability to do his job, which was to move the show forward, to manage time and energy and commercial breaks. He was stuck inside a moment he couldn't steer, and for once he let it show. The NBC stage manager, standing off camera, watched the studio clock. 30 seconds of sustained laughter. 45. A minute. This was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented. Commercial breaks were timed to the second. The show's format was rigid. They were losing control of the schedule. But nobody moved to cut it off. The cameras kept rolling, capturing Carson's face, Ames's discomfort, the audience's uncontrollable reaction. Something was happening that was more valuable than format or timing. A real moment, unscripted and unrepeatable. Carson made another attempt. I want to say this. Laughter obliterated the words. He stopped, laughed himself now, not performing but genuinely caught in the absurdity. Nothing. Ed Ames, still standing in his throwing position, began to laugh too. Not the professional laugh of someone who's found a good bit, but the embarrassed, overwhelmed laugh of someone who's lost control of a situation and has no choice but to surrender to it. His shoulders shook. He covered his face briefly, then dropped his hands, giving up. The laugh continued. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. The audience was past the point of recovery now. Every time the sound started to fade, someone would look at the target again, or at Carson's face, and the wave would build again. Carson walked back to his desk, sat down, picked up his pencil, his standard props, his tools of control. He tapped the pencil on the desk, trying to signal transition, trying to pull focus back to himself and away from the target. The audience laughed harder at his attempt. "Ladies and gentlemen," he tried. The laugh swallowed the formality. He waited. "I want to say, gone." He put his head down on the desk, a gesture of complete defeat. The audience roared approval. When he lifted his head, his hair was slightly mussed, his tie crooked. The polish had cracked just for a moment, and the audience loved him more for it. Finally, gradually, like a wave pulling back from shore, the laugh began to recede. Not because Carson had controlled it, but because it had exhausted itself. Bodies could only sustain that level of reaction for so long. The sound loosened, broke apart, became individual chuckles and gasps. In the relative quiet, Carson found his voice. "Ed, that was—" He stopped himself, measured his words. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen on this show." Ames recovered slightly, nodded. "I swear I wasn't aiming for that." "I know you weren't," Carson said. "That's what makes it perfect." The audience applauded now, warm and appreciative, the tension released. The laugh had lasted approximately 2.5 minutes. An eternity in television time, a moment that couldn't be planned or reproduced. Carson looked at the cameras, at the audience, at Ed Ames. "We're going to commercial," he said, "if we still have sponsors after that." The laugh rippled through the studio one more time, gentler now, tired but satisfied. The red light on camera 1 blinked off. The show went to commercial. The Tonight Show's regular rhythm resumed. But something had shifted. In the commercial break, Carson sat at his desk, not reviewing notes, not preparing for the next segment. He was still processing what had happened. Doc Severinsen walked over, grinning. "You okay, Johnny?" "I couldn't stop it," Carson said, not complaining, observing. "Nobody could have." "I know." Carson smiled, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. "That's the thing. I couldn't stop it, and it was fine. Better than fine." What Carson was recognizing, though he might not have articulated it that night, was something fundamental about his relationship with control. For 3 years, he had built his version of The Tonight Show on precision, on his ability to manage every moment, every pause, every laugh. He was the best in the business at this, better than Parr, better than Steve Allen, better than anyone who had tried to do this particular job. But the Tomahawk moment had revealed something else. That the best moments in live television, maybe in life, were the ones that couldn't be managed. The laugh had been so pure, so genuine, precisely because it existed outside Carson's control, outside anyone's control. It was accidental, unrepeatable, human. The show returned from commercial. Carson finished the episode with his usual professionalism, but the energy had changed. The audience was looser, more connected to him. He was looser too. Some internal calculation shifted by what had just happened. When the show ended and the audience filed out into the December night, they talked about what they'd witnessed. Not Ed Ames's skill with a tomahawk. Not even the placement of the throw, really. What they talked about was Carson's face. The moment when his control had slipped, when he'd been genuinely at a loss, and instead of fighting it, he'd let them see it. In the days that followed, the Tomahawk moment entered television history. It was discussed in variety show circles, written about by critics, referenced by other comedians. NBC received requests to replay the clip. The Tonight Show's ratings ticked upward slightly, a bump of curiosity from people who'd heard about what happened and wanted to see Carson lose control. But the real impact was quieter and more personal. Carson, in his private moments, returned to that feeling, standing next to the target, unable to speak, the laugh too big to manage. It had frightened him slightly, that loss of control. But it had also felt honest in a way that his usual performance didn't quite allow. He was the host of the most successful late-night show in America. He was disciplined, professional, brilliant at his job. But he was also becoming aware, in ways he hadn't been before, of what that job cost. The control he maintained on camera, the distance, the polish, the refusal to be truly vulnerable, was starting to feel less like strength and more like armor. The Tomahawk moment had cracked that armor just for 2.5 minutes. The audience had loved him for it. Maybe more importantly, he had survived it. The show hadn't fallen apart. The format had bent, accommodated the accident, moved forward. Years later, when asked about his favorite moments from The Tonight Show, Carson always mentioned the tomahawk throw. Not because it was the funniest joke he'd ever delivered. It wasn't even his joke. Not because it showcased his skills as a host. It had actually revealed his limitations. He mentioned it because for those 2.5 minutes, he had been genuinely surprised, genuinely helpless, genuinely present in a moment he couldn't predict or control. And the audience had met him there, in that honest space, and they had shared something real. Television, Carson understood, was about connection. But connection required vulnerability, and vulnerability required giving up control. The Tomahawk had taught him that. Not immediately, not all at once. But the seed was planted that night, standing next to a plywood target with a blade stuck in its crotch, listening to an audience laugh at something nobody had planned. Ed Ames went back to Daniel Boone, continued his acting career, eventually returned to music. The Tomahawk moment followed him for the rest of his life, the thing he was most remembered for, despite decades of professional accomplishment. He handled it with grace, understanding that some moments transcend intention, become larger than the people who create them. Johnny Carson hosted The Tonight Show for 27 more years after that December night in 1965. He became more than successful. He became the standard by which all other late-night hosts were measured. His control remained legendary, his timing impeccable, his ability to manage live television unmatched. But those who knew him best, who worked with him night after night, noticed something else as the years went on. He became slightly more willing to let moments breathe, more comfortable with silence, more present when things went wrong, less desperate to fix them immediately. The Tomahawk had changed something small but essential. It had shown him that control wasn't the same as connection, that the best moments in television, maybe in life, weren't the ones you planned perfectly, but the ones you surrendered to honestly. Studio 6B, where it happened, hosted The Tonight Show until 1972, when the program moved to California. The building still stands, part of Rockefeller Center, home now to different programs, different performers. The plywood target is long gone, probably thrown away immediately after the show, never imagined to be worth preserving. But the moment remains. It exists in footage, in memory, in the history of American television. 2.5 minutes, when everything stopped, when the format broke, when Johnny Carson stood helpless and human in front of 400 people and millions watching at home, and let them see him unable to do the thing he did best. And they loved him for it, not despite the loss of control, but because of it. Because for once, the distance collapsed. The armor cracked. The man behind the desk became real, surprised, present. The tomahawk is still there, metaphorically embedded exactly where it landed. A reminder that the best moments can't be planned, that control has limits, that sometimes the only thing to do when everything falls apart is to stand there, look at what happened, and laugh because there's nothing else to do, and laughter, at least, is honest. Johnny Carson learned something that night that would take him years to fully understand, that the part of himself he worked so hard to protect, the vulnerable, surprised, genuinely human part, was exactly what people wanted to see. Not all the time. Television still required structure, format, professionalism. But in moments, in cracks, in accidents like a tomahawk landing where it shouldn't, that's where connection lived. The longest laugh of his career. The moment he couldn't control. The night everything stopped and something real happened instead. That was the throw that changed everything.